Hi there, Graham from Penguin Motors here. Today I've got something a little bit different. We're going to have a little bit of rebuild on a Dyno Dog, which is our mule engine that we've done most of our testing on up till now. It's been in the wars, it's had a hard life, so we're going to have a bit of a refresh on it, and then later in the video we're going to see it back on the dyno in action, making some numbers. What we have got is this here dirty, disgusting lump of full Pinto, which we've affectionately named Dyno Dog. Now, Dyno Dog was basically a scrapyard engine we yanked out of our stores with a view to just testing the functions of the dyno. It did well, it tested it, it proved the dyno worked. I think we then blew a head gasket. I took the head off, dropped the sump, freshened it up with a new set of rings, but that was literally it. Didn't change any of the bearings. We haven't even looked at the main bearings, slapped the head back on it, new set of head bolts. This basically scrapyard engine with nothing more than a new set of rings has done something like 700 or 800 full power dyno pulls. This has done hours and hours and hours of dyno testing. We've revved it to 6,800 RPM, and this is a completely bone stock, never rebuilt engine. We've run nearly 11 to 1 compression on it, and it's been tested with 4 different cylinder heads, different cams, single carb, 40 mil carbs, 45 mil carbs, the same again on a different head. So this has done loads and loads and loads of work. Quite incredible. Because bear in mind, we knew no history on it, we just chucked it on the dyno and ran with it. But the last time it did a pull, I will notice that the oil pressure wasn't what it had been. The oil pressure's definitely dropped off. Didn't make any funny noises or anything, it sounded fine, but clearly from the look at the oil pressure, the bearings had taken a bit of a beating. Now, when we first put it on there, it was a case of, well, let's just run with it, let's see what happens. If it erupts in a pile of smoke and goes bang, don't know, don't care, chuck it away, get another one. But we've kind of got attached to Dyno Dog, so the plan is to take a look at the bearings, give it a bit of a minor refresh, and I mean a minor refresh. We're going to do as little as possible, put it back together so it can go back into service for testing more head and can combos. I'm going to bring you for a close-up in a minute, show you some of what we can see is wrong with it and where we're going to go with it. So looking at blockface here, these are the areas, not surprisingly, where the gaskets tend to blow between the cylinders. It's actually dark there, so that suggests to me the block is sunken away there, and in particular over time the pull on the head bolts and studs tends to pull the upper edges of the block up, leaving a low in the middle. When we skim it flat, we'll take that away and we'll end up with hopefully a good face. We're doing nothing with the bores. The rings are working fine. When it last ran, it made 166 horsepower, so clearly there's nothing wrong with the rings. Here we have the bottom end with a couple of main caps removed. Clearly we can see wear grooves in the journal, which might polish out, but I think this will need a grind. Same with the next bearing. In fact, all the main journals are fairly scored. That's one of the mains, and that's pretty scuffed up. That's pretty scored. There's been a fair bit of crank to bearing contact and a bit of metal moved around. But despite the fact all the mains are worn, look at the big end, it's not so bad. And actual fact that although it was running low on oil pressure, it hasn't actually hammered the ends. One test as to how much grief an end has had is the tightness of the bearing in the shell. I still need to push with some effort to get the shell out the bearing cap. So although it's run low on oil pressure, there was still enough to keep the shell firmly in place, and it hasn't been banging against the crank pin and beating itself to death. And it's the beating, it's the hammer action when there's insufficient oil film in there is what beats the hell out of the big end shells and distorts them, so they lose their fit in the cap. And as soon as they lose their fit in the cap, they spin. I shall strip it now, and when you next see it, it'll be in a lot more bits. And here we have the block in my Bridgeport milling machine being skimmed. To be fair, the Bridgeport isn't the best machine for skimming blocks. It's much more difficult to set up than a purpose-built facing machine, such as the engine reconditioners will do. There's nothing technically wrong with this, it's just a bit more awkward to do. So for a client's engine, or an engine that's actually going to see some real serious use, when I factor the time and everything else into account, I don't do it like this myself. I subcontract it to my trusted machine shop. Oh, machine stopped. Don't know why that should be. That shouldn't happen. It's not ideal, because if the machine stops whilst the cutter's rotating part of the way through the cut, it tends to put a groove in the block. In this case, we got away with it. In the end, I actually finished up by holding the breaker in with one hand and hand cranking the table across to finish it off. Having finished planing it now, the surface isn't bad. It's not quite as smooth as I would normally hope for. Probably a little bit too rough for a multi-layer steel gasket, but for a normal composite gasket, this will do absolutely fine. And at the end of the day, it's our Dyno mill. One side effect of machining the block is that we lose the radius edge at the top of the bore. And you need a radius edge at the top of the bore just to help the rings go down when you fit them. There's many ways to put it back. You can do it with a bearing scraper, you can do it with a grinder, you can do it with some emery paper, half round file. In this instance, I've used what I've got to hand, and it's a half round file. And literally all you need to do is run round, around, and just break the edge so you haven't got a sharp edge. Just enough to allow the rings an easy passage from the ring compressor into the bore. For the record, we took roughly 20 thousandths an inch off the top of the block. That should bring the pistons roughly flush at TDC. That, for any given cylinder head gasket combination, will give you roughly half a ratio more compression. So now it's off to what we call the world's largest dishwasher, which is our industrial parts washing machine for a clean, and then it'll be onto the engine build room for reassembly. Fast forward to the future, or is it the past? Not sure. We had some technical audio issues with some of the upcoming video. I'm going to voice over some of it, so if my lips are doing this but my voice is doing that, you'll know why, because I'm voicing over it. But stick with us, there'll be some interesting stuff there, and at the end you'll see this running. So now we're back in the engine build room. Here's Dyno Dog, fresh from its bath and reface, all ready to for a bit of assembly work. Here we have the replacement crankshaft that's going in. I simply robbed it out of another engine, but the journal's in lovely condition. We salvaged the main bearings that came with the block that this was from, so we'll be reusing those. This engine had already had the con rods and pistons robbed out of it, so I didn't have big ends, but dug around my stores, I found another set of big ends. Not new, but I'm warm. I thought the engine had come out, hadn't been opened up, hadn't been taken apart, and normally you can tell, but I was pretty sure it was going to be standard, but I've measured it and it's actually undersize, which is slightly surprising, but it could have come from the factory like it, because when they machine these journals in the first place, if they make a bit of an error in grinding, the crank is scrap, or they regrind them to a smaller size. So you can have an engine that's never been taken apart in its life, comes out the factory with a crank on undersized bearings. And if you assume they're standard, because you know it's not bent to bits, and you reassemble it with standard sized bearings, you have no oil pressure, knocking noises, and it pretty soon goes badly south. Just to be on the safe side, a quick measure up is important. Going to start, measure up a big end. And this measures up at 51.72. Let's see what size it should be. And here we are on the specs. The original one is 51.98. So that's roughly 0.25 of a millimetre undersize, or in old money, 10 thousandths of an inch. Now, as I've fished out a set of bearings from my stock, I'm just going to run through, because they're not new, I'm just going to run through and check we haven't got any massive wear. For this, I'm going to use a micrometer, which is a ball mic. You see, it's got one rounded edge, which fits really well when you measure something round, because you can't measure a curved surface with two flat surfaces. We can just run through them, run the mic down, and very quickly check the bearings are all the same thickness and there's no undue wear. But what you can't use, or not easily, is a normal micrometer because of the flat faces. If you take a rod like that, put it in your mic, measure it there, you now know what the thickness of that is. So you could measure a bearing using a normal mic and a rod. It's a bit of a faff. It's much better if you've got a ball mic. One last thing I want to do with crank, I've already measured the mains, I know what they are, is I'm going to use my usual pipe cleaner trick and just shove a couple of pipe cleaners through the oil galleries. They're coming through perfectly clean, and more importantly, we know there's no lumps of grit, dirt and debris in there. The very worst you can do with a pipe cleaner is maybe leave a little bit of fluff, which is harmless. You'd normally blow it through with an airline anyway, but for a DIY man, it's a quick, easy check. When it comes to fitting the crankshaft and the pistons, there's two ways around you can do it. Most of the time we put the crankshaft in first and then insert the pistons onto the crank. You could do it the other way around. In fact, there's one or two engines you have to do it the other way around, such as the Daimler SP250, Daimler Dart V8 engine. The com rods won't pass through the blocks, so you put them in through the underside of the crankcase. Most of the time, most engine builders will always fit the crankshaft first, check that for fit, check that for rotation, and then fit the pistons afterwards. It's just easier to put one piston and rod on a crankshaft that's already fitted than it is to put a crankshaft in an engine with all the rods in there and you're trying to line them all up. Invert the engine and we can put some bearings in. Making sure the surface of the block and the backs of the bearings are completely free from any grit. Any grit or debris will lift the bearing up and make it, at best, make the crank a tight fit. At worst, the crank won't turn. Note the fit. The shells should be a snug fit in the block. They should be almost a snap fit. Nice and tight. No movement. Drop of oil or assembly lube. Right, I'm ready to put the crankshaft in. Perhaps slightly unusually, when I fit the crank on a Pinto, I like to do it with the oil seal already on the end of the crank. You don't need to, but I find it much easier to put it on there, put it in, and then put the caps on, than try and knock the seal in afterwards. So we're going to lay the crank in the block. Push our seal into position so it's flush, and fit the upper half of the thrust washers. Fitting the thrust washers, it's easy to make a mistake and put them the wrong way around. If you look at the thrust washers, they've got an oil groove, and the back of the thrust washer must be positioned against the block face, with the groove against the crankshaft. Push that in there. If you put them in the wrong way round, the engine will still run. It will still turn, but it will have very rapid wear. And the crankshaft will float up and down. When you put your foot in the clutch, it pushes on the end of the crankshaft, the thrust washers take the strain. If you put them the wrong way round, eventually they destroy the crankshaft, they destroy themselves, and they usually drop out and you're into an engine rebuild. That's the upper bearings in and the thrust washers. 6, 8, 10. Small drop of oil for the threads. Main caps, important, they're in the right order. Fit them like that, the engine will lock up, won't turn. I fit one the wrong way round, it won't turn. The middle one, you have to put it in with the thrust washers, same time. Bit of oil and assembly lube. You should be able to screw the bolts in finger tight all the way down. So, voiceover from the future here. Did you spot the mistake? Find out in a minute. Torque setting £70 foot. We normally snug it up part of the way, halfway each side, and then pull it down the rest of the way. The crank should turn nicely, which it does in this case. With experience, you get a lot of feel. Now at this point, what I normally do is check the end flow. So we're going to put my DTI gauge on the end of the crank, and I will be levering the crank backwards and forwards. These have normally got around 4.5 thou end float. Here we go. I've set it at 0, lever it one way, 3. Okay. That's not a lot. They normally have more. So just to double check, there we go. In the book, 3 to 11 thou. We've got 3, but that is tight. That's at the small end. Unusual, but the tolerance is a tolerance. It's in tolerance, so we're gonna carry on. And a really good point to note here is maybe on a road engine, I might be a little bit concerned about the clearance being on the minimum side. However, it's going on the dyno, and on the dyno, it's the same as with an automatic. There is no end load on the thrust angle on the crank. It's not pushed on. Whereas with a manual car, when you put your foot on the clutch and you're actually pushing on the end of the crank. So that little bit of end float for some oil flow becomes more important. This engine's never going in a car anyway. So for the moment, I'm just going to carry on. So let's fit all the rest of the caps, fit them, torque them, check it turns, right? Bit of goo, which seals the rear ends of the main bearing. And at this point, hang on, I've just realised my mistake. I've left the locating dowels out the centre main, which will be responsible for the lack of end float. Now, how did I make this mistake? It's unusual, but I don't normally assemble engines talking to a camera. We all make mistakes. It's something that would never happen in a proper build. At this point, I'm now working the crank back. That's it, 4th thou. That's much more like I expected. Would it have stayed like it? No, because I would have realised my mistake anyway, because down here we have a bucket of bits. When the engine's assembled, there are no bits left in the bucket. Rear main cap. You may notice when I do the caps up, I hold the block and wedge the engine stand with my feet to stop it running away. However, another solution is to turn it on its side and torque it on its side, and then the engine stand doesn't try and roll away. So one little job left to do now is put these little wedges in and tap them down, and what the wedges do is they force the sealant through the microscopic gap between the crank and the block, cap and the block, and it just forces sealant out and will seal that gap. Otherwise you'll end up with an oil leak. So if it's right, when you've put it together and everything's happy, you should be able to turn the crank quite easily with just some effort from one little finger. This turns nicely. Hi guys, we got a little bonus. Well, to be honest, I think it's me that's got the bonus. We've got mail. We've never had mail before. We've got mail. It's up here. It's from Giles Hamilton, and I know that because it says so on the box. It rattles and it's quite weighty. Oh wow. James, there's a carburettor.
Another one to add to your collection.
Yeah. It's a 2836, 2 litre Capri, 1600 GT Crossflow carb. That's fantastic. Thank you, Giles. We've got lots and lots of carburetor testing coming up. So another carburetor is going to be fantastic. You can't have too many. And these days, these things are quite expensive. There used to be a time when we used to either throw them away or weigh them in the scrap because nobody wanted them. And now they actually fetch really good money. So excellent. Thank you, Giles. That is going to help us out no end. Ah, a tobacco tin. Now, everyone's granddad had one of these. It sounds like carburetor jets. Oh, and it is. Emulsion tube, pump jets, mains. That's a Delauto one. DGAV or 2836. 2836. Yeah, that'll fit 2836, but I meant to say 3236. Brilliant. These things cost a ton. I've just placed another order. I've just spent about 160 odd quid, which will probably get me fewer jets than is in that tin. Much appreciated. Thanks again. And now, back to Dyno Dog. Caps off, bit of oil, lubricate the bores, bit in the rings, around the pistons, and some lubrication for the shells. Pop the piston in the ring compressor, snug it down, take the piston, drop it in the bore. And there with the hammer, we're just tapping the edge of the compressor to make sure it sits flat with the block, and a bump with the shaft of the hammer, and in the piston goes. When you sit the ring compressor on the top of the block, it's important that the compressor sits properly flush against the block all the way around, so that when you tap the piston with the shaft of your hammer or whatever you use, that the ring passes neatly and quickly into the bore. Because if it doesn't, you can have the ring poke out in a tiny gap. And if the ring pokes out, one or two things will happen. Either it won't go, the piston won't go in, okay, you just redo it again, or worse still, you damage or break the ring. In this case, as I tapped it in, the bearing shell dislocated slightly, so I've just snuck it back into place, bit of lube on the cap, and put the cap on. Now it's important the cap goes the right way around. When I stripped the block, I numbered them so I know which caps goes where on the correct way round. You can also get an idea by looking at the cutouts for the tags. Some engines, both cutouts go on the same side, others are opposite. Once again, we took it down, and after each one I always check that the engine rotates nicely. As you fit more pistons, it should progressively get more difficult to rotate, but it should always turn quite easily. I much prefer to put the pistons in with the crank pins at the bottom and then push the piston down rather than try to fit the piston with a crank pin at the top. So now a quick time lapse, because I'm sure you don't want to watch this in real time. Lastly, for this bit of the build, the oil pump itself. The oil pump is actually the best lubricated part of the whole engine. Unfortunately, it's also the only part that isn't filtered. Any metallic debris or anything will get between the lobes of the rotors and the inner and outer, and it will score it. So the best place for these is in the bin. And here we have a pump that I've actually salvaged from another used engine. The reason being that the new pumps are generally fairly poor quality, and if you've got an original Ford pump that's unworn, it's actually a better deal than buying a modern replacement. We'll pop the top off here and you can see, yeah, lovely look. No pits, no grooves, no grinding, no scores. That's a lovely condition. Excellent. That's going to go straight back into use. Oil pump drive. Little clip on it. Some say the clip goes one way up, some clip goes the other way up. To be honest, I don't really think it matters. We've seen plenty of engines without the clip. The purpose of the clip is to stop the oil pump drive coming out if you remove the distributor. Some say that without the clip the engine can develop a rattle as the little shaft slides up and down. Don't know, I've not seen it myself. At the worst it's going to make a noise, but I always put the clip in anyway. So this is Graham from the future again. This was the end of this video. Now it's not anymore. Graham from the future is now clean shaven, and Dyno Dog is heading back to the dyno room for some action. Back to the future. We're back to the dyno cell. Dyno Dog's now complete. It's had a head fitted. We're about to do a test for Classic Ford magazine. I can't tell you the content of the test yet, but what I can tell you is that we've raised the compression of the engine to 9.75. We've fitted a Piper 285 cam and a pair of 40 DCOE, and we're about to go in and do a few power runs. So boys, let's turn the pumps on and let's make some noise. Okay, so run done. Piper 285, 45 DCOE, and like I said earlier, let's see what we got. 138.9 brake horsepower at 6,000 RPM and 138 pound-foot torque at 4,400 RPM. Just to spice things up a little bit, I'm going to put the graph up, but first I'm going to put a graph up with the same head and the same carburetors, but a standard cam. Here we go, folks, the standard engine, or should I say standard cam, and we're going to now overlay the test with a 285. That's a big difference. The standard cam gave us 117 horsepower and the 285 bumped it up to 138. And just for a bonus, I'm going to chuck you in an F2 oval racing cam. Again, same head, same carbs, oval cam. And as we can see, the oval cam sacrificed a big chunk of torque here, which obviously meant a bit of a drop in power. But out at the big end, look, big gain, and didn't it rev on? And the oval cam actually gave 149 horsepower. Again, same engine, same head, same carbs. So Graham here, even further into the future, you see Dyno Dog is back on a twin choke Weber, another part of some series of tests. In the past, I've promised you comparison tests between carburetors, types coming. They are coming. This again is part of a test for Classic Ford, so I can't tell you too much yet. And what's really interesting, this time we've tested the carburetor with spacers, ported inlet manifolds, and spacers between the head and the intake manifold, with some really interesting results. So either get down to the newsagent and buy yourself a copy of Classic Ford, or subscribe, because these tests will be coming your way. Catch you later.